In the summer of 1844, Atlanta society believed it knew the meaning of virtue. It believed purity could be trained, obedience enforced, and reputation preserved through discipline and prayer. But behind the white columns of one of the city's most respected homes, a secret was unfolding that would expose the hypocrisy beneath Southern morality. This is not a story about love. It is not a story about rebellion. It is a story about control, and the devastating punishment a mother chose when control slipped through her fingers. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Atlanta in 1844 was a city still convincing itself that it belonged among the great Southern capitals, and nowhere was that ambition more visible than in the homes of its most respected families, where reputation was cultivated with the same precision as cotton fields, and where daughters were raised not as individuals, but as symbols meant to reassure the world that order, virtue, and hierarchy were intact. The Whitfield estate sat just beyond the busiest streets, its white-painted columns visible from the road like a declaration of moral authority, and inside that house lived 19-year-old Eleanor Whitfield, a young woman Atlanta society spoke of with rehearsed admiration, as though she were less a person than a finished product. From childhood, Eleanor had been shaped to fit an ideal that was never questioned aloud. She woke when she was told, ate what was placed before her, practiced piano until her fingers ached, recited scripture until the words lost meaning, and smiled when instructed, because smiling suggested contentment, and contentment suggested virtue. Her education had been carefully selected, first under private tutors and later at a finishing school in Charleston, where she learned French phrases she would never use in honest conversation and embroidery patterns meant to occupy hands that were never allowed to grasp anything real. When she returned to Atlanta at 17, she was praised not for her thoughts or curiosities, but for how effortlessly she embodied expectation. Men admired her beauty from a sanctioned distance. Women praised her manners while quietly measuring her as competition for advantageous matches. At the center of it all stood her mother, Margaret Whitfield, a woman whose name carried weight in church circles and charitable committees, whose reputation for moral strictness was both admired and feared, and who believed without hesitation that discipline was love's highest form. Margaret did not simply guide Eleanor's life, she orchestrated it. Every visitor was vetted, every letter was read, every walk beyond the veranda required permission. In Margaret's mind, the world was full of dangers not because it was cruel, but because it was tempting, and temptation, once indulged, led inevitably to ruin. Eleanor's engagement to Thomas Caldwell, the son of a respected judge, was announced when she was barely 18, not because of affection, but because it represented the culmination of Margaret's life's work, proof that vigilance produced results. The engagement was spoken of as inevitable, appropriate, ordained even, and Eleanor learned quickly that her role was to accept rather than to question. Atlanta society watched her closely in those months, praising her modest dresses, her downcast eyes, her careful speech, never asking whether any of it reflected her inner life, because inner lives were not required of daughters meant to secure alliances. Yet beneath the surface of that carefully maintained perfection, something else was forming, quietly and dangerously, not as rebellion at first, but as awareness. Eleanor began to understand that her value was conditional, entirely dependent on her compliance, and that love, as practiced in her world, was indistinguishable from control. She felt watched, even when alone, her thoughts circling questions she had no language to express, desires she had been taught to name as sin before she could understand them as human. The Whitfield plantation, sprawling and busy, offered a strange contrast to the suffocating order of the main house. There, life moved according to labor rather than ritual, and while the brutality of enslavement was ever present, there was also an honesty in the way people looked at one another, unfiltered by performance. Eleanor noticed this difference long before she understood it. She noticed how the enslaved men spoke plainly to one another, How their laughter, when it came, sounded unrestrained, how their presence was at once essential and deliberately ignored by those who claimed ownership over them. Margaret considered them invisible tools, necessary but irrelevant, and this belief shaped the plantation structure. Certain men were assigned tasks closer to the house precisely because they were deemed safe, reliable, forgettable. Eleanor absorbed her mother's certainty without question, until the day she realized that being unseen could also mean being free from scrutiny. That realization did not arrive with thunder or intent. It arrived quietly, during an afternoon when Eleanor watched from an upstairs window as workers moved between buildings, their lives unfolding without her mother's constant supervision. For the first time, she felt envy rather than fear. She did not yet understand what she wanted, only that the life prepared for her felt increasingly like a cage polished to look like privilege. She began to linger longer during permitted walks, to notice faces she had been trained to overlook, to register curiosity where there had once been indifference. This curiosity frightened her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt real. And in a world where her existence was defined by appearances, reality itself was dangerous. Margaret, sensing shifts she could not name, tightened control further, mistaking Eleanor's growing silence for modesty and her restraint for obedience. Atlanta continued to praise the Whitfields, unaware that the very qualities they celebrated were cracking under pressure, that the perfect daughter they admired was already dividing herself into versions, one presented to the world and another hidden, watching, waiting. Nothing in Eleanor's upbringing had prepared her to understand the cost of that division, or the violence with which her mother would respond once the illusion of control shattered. At this stage, Atlanta still believed the Whitfield household represented stability, that Eleanor was safe within the structure built around her, and that virtue, once instilled, could not fail. That belief would not survive the summer. As the heat of that summer settled over Atlanta, thick and unrelenting, Eleanor's inner division deepened, not as a sudden break from the life she had been assigned, but as a slow erosion, the kind that happens when something living is pressed too tightly for too long and begins to seek air wherever it can. The days grew longer, Margaret's vigilance grew sharper, and yet, paradoxically, the plantation itself became Eleanor's only refuge, because it existed just far enough from the drawing rooms and prayer circles to feel unsupervised, even while remaining entirely within her mother's domain. She began inventing reasons to be outdoors, fresh air for her nerves, a desire to sketch the landscape, an interest in learning more about the operations of the estate, which Margaret encouraged only because she believed knowledge reinforced hierarchy. To Margaret, familiarity bred authority, not temptation. She could not imagine her daughter stepping outside the boundaries she herself had enforced so rigidly. It was during these wanderings that Eleanor first began to truly see the men who labored there, not as an indistinct mass, but as individuals whose presence contrasted sharply with the artificial restraint of her own life. There was Samuel, older than most, quiet and observant, trusted with keys and inventories, because obedience had been carved into him by years of survival. There was Isaiah, younger, quick with a dry smile that vanished the moment a white overseer appeared. There was Thomas, not the fiancé whose name Eleanor rarely spoke aloud anymore, but another Thomas, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, who worked the stables and spoke only when necessary. There were others, too, men whose names Eleanor learned slowly, carefully, as though naming them might itself be an act of defiance. At first her interactions were brief and proper, questions about tasks, instructions repeated exactly as her mother would have given them, her tone distant enough to preserve the illusion of order. But the longer she lingered, the more that distance narrowed, not because she sought intimacy, but because she craved recognition that did not come with conditions. These men did not look at her as an ideal or a symbol, they looked at her as a person passing through their space, curious, restless, unsure. That difference mattered more than Eleanor understood at the time. It made her feel visible in a way Atlanta society never had. The first secret meeting did not begin as a meeting at all, but as an accident of timing, a moment when Eleanor wandered farther than usual and found herself inside the shadowed tobacco barn, the air heavy with dust and heat, where Samuel had been working alone. She should have left immediately. Every rule she had ever been taught demanded it. Instead, she stayed, asking questions she already knew the answers to, listening as he spoke cautiously, measuring every word, and in that shared pause, something shifted. It was not romance in the way novels pretended it to be. It was recognition of mutual risk. Samuel understood, perhaps better than Eleanor, what it meant for her to be there, what it could cost both of them if discovered, and yet he did not raise his voice or turn her away. He simply stood, aware, present, and Eleanor felt for the first time the gravity of her own choices. That moment did not end in scandal, only in silence, but it marked a line crossed, one Eleanor could not uncross. After that, she returned, not always to the same place, not always to the same man, but always with the same hunger, to step outside the role imposed on her and experience something unscripted. Each encounter reinforced the illusion that she was in control, that secrecy itself was power. She believed, dangerously, that because the men had more to lose, her secret was safer with them than it would ever be with her peers. In her mind, silence was guaranteed by fear, and fear was something she had been taught to wield without consequence. Over weeks that blurred together, Eleanor's double life expanded, carefully compartmentalized. Mornings belonged to her mother, to etiquette lessons, wedding preparations, polite smiles exchanged with Thomas Caldwell, whose presence felt increasingly unreal. Afternoons belonged to the plantation, to stolen moments arranged through glances and timing rather than words, to spaces deliberately chosen because they were overlooked by those who assumed nothing improper could occur under their noses. Eleanor told herself stories to justify what she was doing, that she was breaking free, that she was reclaiming agency, that the men involved were participants rather than captives in a system that stripped them of choice. She did not fully confront the imbalance of power that followed her everywhere, even into secrecy, because to do so would have meant acknowledging that her freedom was built on the same structure that bound them. Instead, she focused on the immediacy of feeling, on the way the world seemed sharper, louder, more real when she was not performing. The danger itself became intoxicating. Each successful evasion convinced her that she was clever, untouchable, that her mother's control had limits she could navigate indefinitely. Margaret, meanwhile, noticed changes she misinterpreted. Eleanor grew quieter, more inward, less enthusiastic about wedding plans. To Margaret, this was premarital modesty, a sign of proper restraint. She praised her daughter's seriousness, her gravity, blind to the fact that Eleanor's silence was not obedience, but containment. The household continued its routines, servants moving through rooms, enslaved laborers maintaining the estate, Atlanta society admiring from a distance, unaware that the Whitfield name, so carefully protected, was being risked daily by a daughter who had learned to confuse secrecy with safety. Eleanor did not plan for discovery, she planned around it, assuming that vigilance alone could hold chaos at bay. She did not consider the randomness of timing, the unpredictability of her mother's movements, or the simple truth that control, once challenged, often responds with cruelty rather than correction. As summer deepened, so did Margaret's schedule of church meetings and charity visits, and Eleanor, lulled by routine, allowed herself a fatal confidence. The barn she chose that afternoon was familiar, the timing precise, the world seemingly aligned in her favor. She could not know that on that same day, Margaret Whitfield, guided by a sudden and uncharacteristic impulse, would leave her meeting early, her carriage turning back toward the estate under a sun that seemed to burn away pretense itself. The distance between secrecy and exposure, once so carefully managed, was about to collapse, not because Eleanor had been careless, but because she had mistaken silence for forgiveness and fear for loyalty in a world where neither was ever truly hers to command. Margaret Whitfield's return to the plantation that afternoon was not dramatic in the way later gossip would insist. There was no thunder, no omen, no raised voice announcing fate's arrival, only the soft grinding of carriage wheels against dirt and the subtle shift of routine that no one noticed until it was too late. She had left the church meeting with a sense of irritation she could not name, a tightening behind the eyes that told her something was misaligned, and though she attributed it to heat or fatigue, her instincts, honed by decades of maintaining order in a society built on appearances, were sharper than she allowed herself to admit. The plantation appeared as it always did, quietly industrious, orderly, obedient, and that familiarity should have reassured her, yet it unsettled her instead, as though perfection itself had begun to feel rehearsed. She dismissed the carriage and chose to walk, an unusual decision that would later be remembered as the hinge on which everything turned, her shoes sinking slightly into the earth as she passed rows of labourers who lowered their eyes at her approach. Margaret acknowledged them with curt nods, her mind elsewhere, her attention drawn not to what was visible, but to what felt absent. Eleanor should have been in the house, preparing for the evening, perhaps practicing piano or reviewing correspondence, yet when Margaret stepped inside, the rooms felt hollow, too still. A servant offered an explanation. Miss Eleanor had gone out for fresh air, and Margaret accepted it without comment, though the phrase lingered unpleasantly. Fresh air had become a convenient excuse, one Margaret herself had endorsed, never imagining it could become a veil for defiance. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, checking rooms without appearing to search, her composure intact even as a subtle alarm began to sound within her. When she stepped back outside, the afternoon sun pressing down with suffocating insistence, it was not Eleanor she heard first, but sound itself, low, indistinct, carried on the breeze from a direction that made Margaret pause. The old storage barn stood at the far edge of the plantation, long unused for its original purpose, a place she rarely, though, about because it had never demanded her attention. Now, something about it did. She told herself it was nothing, that the sounds were labor-related, that there was no reason for a woman of her standing to investigate such things personally, and yet her feet carried her forward with a resolve that surprised even her. As she approached, the air grew heavier, thick with dust and heat, and the sounds became unmistakable, not explicit, but charged, wrong in a way that bypassed reason and struck directly at instinct. Margaret did not hesitate. She did not call out. She did not prepare herself. She reached for the barn doors and pulled them open with a force born not of anger, but of certainty. What she saw in that suspended moment did not align neatly with later retellings, which would exaggerate and distort, but it was enough. More than enough. Eleanor stood there, caught in the reality she had convinced herself would remain hidden, surrounded by 5 enslaved men whose expressions shifted instantly from guarded to terrified, the imbalance of power in the room rearranging itself in an instant. As Margaret's presence reasserted the hierarchy Eleanor had believed she could momentarily escape. Time seemed to fracture. Eleanor did not scream, she did not move, her mind emptied, the stories she had told herself collapsing under the weight of her mother's gaze. Margaret, for her part, did not shout or strike or weep. Her reaction was far more dangerous. She went very still. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that absorbs sound rather than amplifies it, and in that silence Margaret assessed the scene with the same precision she applied to household accounts or social arrangements. This was not in her mind a moment of maternal grief. It was a breach, a contamination, an existential threat to everything she had built. She understood immediately that this was not a singular lapse, not a misunderstanding to be corrected quietly. The presence of multiple men erased any possibility of denial, and Eleanor's frozen expression confirmed what Margaret already knew. This was sustained, deliberate, repeated. The men dropped their eyes, some stepping back instinctively, aware that discovery carried consequences far beyond Eleanor's shame. Margaret addressed none of them. They were, in her calculation, secondary elements, tools and evidence rather than agents. Her focus never left her daughter, whose face she studied not with anger, but with something colder, a recognition that Eleanor had not merely disobeyed, but humiliated her in a way that demanded retribution, not reconciliation. Margaret spoke only once in that moment, her voice low and even, instructing the men to leave immediately and return to their assigned duties, an order they obeyed without hesitation. Relief and dread indistinguishable as they passed her. Eleanor remained, alone now, exposed not physically but existentially, stripped of the illusion that secrecy had made her powerful. Margaret did not ask questions. She did not need to. She turned and walked away, and that, more than anything else, shattered Eleanor. The absence of confrontation, the refusal to engage, signaled something far worse than punishment. It signaled planning. For the rest of that day, Eleanor was confined to her room under the guise of illness, servants instructed to bring food she could not eat, the house itself shifting subtly as Margaret resumed her role with mechanical precision. That evening, letters were written, visits arranged, decisions made with ruthless clarity. Margaret understood that gossip was inevitable, but she also understood that gossip could be managed if released on her terms. She would not allow whispers to define the narrative. She would seize it, shape it, and in doing so, demonstrate to Atlanta society that no transgression, even one committed by her own blood, would be tolerated beneath her roof. Eleanor lay awake that night, replaying the moment of discovery in Fragim. NTs, each more devastating than the last, realizing too late that her mother's morality was not rooted in protection, but in control, and that the punishment awaiting her would not be private, merciful, or corrective. It would be exemplary. Margaret spent the night composing invitations framed as urgent social gatherings, leveraging her influence to ensure attendance from the very families whose approval she valued most. By morning, word had spread not of scandal, but of an unusual summons, cloaked in respectability, curiosity doing the rest. Eleanor, watching from her window as preparations began below, felt the weight of inevitability settle over her, a certainty that whatever came next would not simply end her engagement or her standing, but would redefine her entirely in the eyes of a society that consumed transgression with a hunger sharpened by hypocrisy. She had believed herself clever, untouchable, operating within cracks her mother could not see. Now, confronted with the machinery of respectability turning inexorably toward her, Eleanor understood that the true danger had never been discovery alone, but who would control the story once the doors were opened, and in Atlanta of 1844, Margaret Whitfield intended to make an example that no one would ever forget. By the time dawn broke over the Whitfield plantation, the machinery of Margaret Whitfield's resolve was already in motion, silent but relentless, and Eleanor sensed it in the way the house itself seemed to rearrange around her, as though walls and corridors had aligned to funnel her toward a single unavoidable end. Servants moved with unusual precision, instructed not to speak unless spoken to, their eyes carefully lowered, yet the tension was palpable, thick as the humid Georgia air that pressed through the open windows. Eleanor was allowed to bathe and dress, not in mourning or disgrace, but in one of her finest gowns, the pale fabric chosen deliberately by her mother later that morning, when Margaret entered the room without knocking and assessed her daughter, not as a parent, but as a presentation. Eleanor attempted to speak then, to plead or explain or at least ask what was to be done, but Margaret raised a single finger, silencing her with a look that carried no anger, only finality. In that look, Eleanor recognized the truth she had been avoiding since childhood. Her mother did not rage because rage would imply loss of control, and Margaret Whitfield did not lose control. She informed Eleanor, calmly and without elaboration, that guests would be arriving by late afternoon, that Eleanor would be expected to behave with composure, and that any deviation from dignity would be interpreted as defiance, a word Eleanor understood now carried consequences far beyond punishment. No further explanation was offered, but Eleanor did not need one. The choice of gown, the summoning of prominent families, the deliberate delay between discovery and consequence, all of it pointed toward something public, something ritualized. Margaret had decided not merely to discipline her daughter, but to cleanse the stain Eleanor had placed upon the Whitfield name, and such cleansing in Margaret's worldview required witnesses. As the day wore on, the plantation transformed, tables arranged, chairs set in precise rows near the main house, the atmosphere resembling a formal gathering rather than a reckoning, and that contrast terrified Eleanor more than any threat of physical punishment could have. She watched from the upper floor as carriages began to arrive, one after another, each bearing families whose approval had once felt abstract and distant, now crystallizing into faces she recognized. Women who had praised her refinement, men who had evaluated her as a suitable match, mothers who had measured her worth against their own daughters. Their curiosity was evident, whispers exchanged behind gloved hands, speculation restrained only by etiquette, and Eleanor realized with a sickening clarity that whatever her mother intended, it had already succeeded in one respect. It had made Eleanor the center of attention before a word had been spoken. Margaret greeted each guest personally, her demeanor flawless, her reputation for moral severity lending the gathering an air of solemnity rather than scandal, and Eleanor understood that this, too, was calculated. By framing the event as something serious but respectable, Margaret ensured attendance from those who might otherwise have declined, and by hosting it herself, she positioned herself not as a woman defending her pride, but as a matriarch enforcing standards. When the guests were seated, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn, Margaret finally summoned Eleanor downstairs. The descent felt endless, each step echoing too loudly in Eleanor's ears, the faces turning toward her as she appeared at the top of the staircase, pale and composed only by necessity. She was guided to a raised platform Margaret had arranged near the front, not high enough to appear theatrical, but elevated enough to command attention, and Eleanor's heart pounded as she realized there would be no escape, no interruption, no quiet resolution. Margaret stepped forward then, addressing the assembly with measured gravity, explaining that a serious moral failing had occurred under her roof, one she could not in good conscience conceal or excuse, regardless of blood ties. She spoke of duty, of standards, of the corrosive effect of secrecy, each word reinforcing her authority while stripping Eleanor of any remaining illusion of protection. Then, without raising her voice, Margaret turned to Eleanor and instructed her to speak. Eleanor hesitated, her throat closing, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing into her like physical force, and in that hesitation Margaret leaned closer and whispered words only Eleanor could hear, a reminder of obedience framed as mercy. Trembling, Eleanor began. At first her voice barely carried, but Margaret corrected her posture, insisting she stand straight, face forward, project. Eleanor obeyed, and with each sentence, the reality of her humiliation deepened. She was made to confess, not in generalities, but in detail, recounting meetings, locations, durations, each admission drawing audible reactions from the crowd, gasps quickly stifled, murmurs rippling despite efforts at decorum. Eleanor felt herself fragmenting, her sense of self dissolving as her private life was dismantled piece by piece, repurposed as a cautionary tale. Margaret did not interrupt except to prompt clarity, ensuring nothing could be misinterpreted or minimized. The enslaved men were never named, their identities rendered irrelevant by Margaret's framing. This was not about them, she made clear, but about Eleanor's moral collapse, a collapse that Margaret positioned as a personal betrayal not just of family, but of society itself. Eleanor caught glimpses of familiar faces, the mother of her fiancé stiff with outrage, the man himself pale and rigid, his eyes fixed not on Eleanor but on the ground, as though even looking at her might implicate him in her disgrace. When Eleanor faltered, overcome by shame, Margaret allowed a pause only long enough for the silence to deepen, then insisted she continue, transforming Eleanor's vulnerability into proof of guilt rather than a plea for compassion. By the time Eleanor finished, her voice hoarse, her body numb, the damage was irreversible. The audience sat in stunned quiet, the weight of what they had witnessed settling unevenly, some already calculating how quickly to distance themselves, others silently relieved that the scandal was not their own. Margaret concluded the gathering with a declaration that Eleanor's engagement was dissolved, that appropriate steps would be taken to ensure her daughter would no longer pose a moral risk to others, and that the Whitfield household would continue to uphold the standards expected of it. There was no apology, no appeal for understanding, only resolution. Guests departed shortly thereafter, conversations muted, reputations quietly recalibrating as news spread faster than the departing carriages. Eleanor remained on the platform long after the last visitor had gone, dismissed but not released. Her life effectively ended in the space of a single afternoon. As twilight fell, Margaret finally addressed her again, informing her of arrangements already made, of relocation, of disappearance framed as correction, and Eleanor understood then that this public punishment was not the end, but the beginning of a new form of erasure. She had been displayed, judged, and condemned, not by a mob, but by the very structures that had once elevated her. And as she was led away from the gathering space, the echo of her own confession lingering in the humid air, Eleanor realized that her mother's greatest cruelty was not exposure, but control of the narrative, ensuring that in the story Atlanta would tell, Eleanor Whitfield would exist only as a warning, stripped of context, agency, and mercy, while Margaret Whitfield would be remembered as the woman who chose reputation over blood and never once wavered. Eleanor was not allowed to mourn the life she had lost, because mourning implies time, and Margaret Whitfield allowed her daughter none of that luxury the morning after the gathering. Before the echoes of carriage wheels had fully faded from the red Georgia clay, Eleanor was awakened before sunrise and informed, without ceremony, that she would be leaving the plantation before noon. There was no destination named at first, only instructions delivered with the same precise calm Margaret used when managing household accounts or negotiating cotton prices, and it was that calm that crushed Eleanor more completely than anger ever could, because it made clear that her mother considered the matter finished, resolved, catalogued, and filed away. Servants packed Eleanor's belongings under supervision, selecting only what Margaret deemed appropriate, leaving behind jewelry gifted by suitors, dresses associated with public appearances, letters that hinted at a future that would never arrive, and Eleanor watched from her chair as objects that had once defined her place in society were quietly removed from reach, each omission another thread severed. Margaret entered midway through the packing, examined the trunk, and removed several items herself, explaining that Eleanor would no longer require reminders of who she had been. And Eleanor realized then that exile was not merely geographic but psychological, a forced rebirth without identity. As the carriage was prepared, Margaret finally disclosed the destination, a religious institution several days' travel away, distant enough to ensure silence, strict enough to enforce obedience, and respectable enough to prevent questions. Eleanor understood immediately that this was not refuge but containment, a place where she would exist outside society's view, neither dead nor alive in the public sense, preserved only as an example spoken of in hushed tones. The journey itself unfolded in a haze of exhaustion and dread, the rhythmic sway of the carriage lulling Eleanor into a state that felt almost dissociative, landscapes passing that once symbolized familiarity, now reduced to meaningless scenery, and with every mile, Eleanor felt herself being erased from the map of her former life. When they arrived, the institution loomed stark and austere, its walls imposing not through grandeur but through uniformity, the absence of ornament signaling a philosophy that valued restraint above all else. Eleanor was received not as a guest but as an assignment, her name recorded without comment, her past neither acknowledged nor denied, and within hours she was dressed in plain garments indistinguishable from those worn by the other women housed there. Margaret did not accompany her inside. She lingered only long enough to deliver final instructions to the matron, ensuring that Eleanor would be kept from correspondence, from visitors, from any form of expression that might reassert her individuality, and then she departed without farewell. Eleanor watched her mother leave through a narrow window, the carriage shrinking into the distance, and in that moment something inside her fractured quietly, not with drama but with resignation, as she accepted that the woman who had raised her, shaped her, and ultimately destroyed her would never look back. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and Eleanor learned quickly that time moved differently in a place designed to suppress rather than nurture. Routines were rigid, silence enforced, reflection encouraged only within the boundaries of prescribed repentance, and Eleanor's story, stripped of nuance, was repackaged as a moral lesson she was expected to internalize. Yet beneath the enforced calm, Eleanor's mind remained restless, replaying the public gathering over and over, not as memory but as interrogation, each detail examined for meaning, each face remembered not for its judgment but for its complicity. She began to understand that her punishment had served multiple purposes. It had preserved her family's power by demonstrating control. It had reassured society that the established order could correct its own deviations. And it had redirected outrage away from systemic hypocrisy and toward an individual scapegoat. This realization did not bring comfort, but it did bring clarity, and clarity became Eleanor's quiet rebellion. She observed the other women in the institution, noting how many shared similar fates. Sent away for indiscretions that threatened reputations, their stories simplified, their complexities flattened, and Eleanor recognized herself in their silences. Over time, she learned which rules could be bent without consequence, which routines offered moments of privacy, and how to reclaim fragments of agency within constraint, small acts of defiance invisible to those who believed her broken. News from the outside world reached her only in fragments, carried by new arrivals or whispered by staff who assumed she no longer cared, and from these fragments, Eleanor pieced together the aftermath of her disgrace. Her former fiancé married another. Within a year, the Whitfield name remained intact, spoken of with renewed respect for Margaret's firmness, and Eleanor herself became a cautionary anecdote invoked to reinforce obedience among daughters who had witnessed her fall from grace. The knowledge that her suffering had been converted into social currency hardened something within her, transforming shame into a quiet, enduring resolve not to internalize the narrative imposed upon her. She began to write secretly, using scraps of paper salvaged from discarded materials, recording her memories not as confession but as testimony, reclaiming her story from the version told without her consent. Writing became survival, a way to assert existence in a world determined to erase it, and though she knew these pages might never be read, the act itself was defiance enough. Years passed, and Eleanor aged into a woman unrecognizable from the debutante Atlanta once celebrated. Her beauty faded not through neglect but through time and stress, her education rendered obsolete by isolation, yet her mind sharpened by observation and reflection. She understood now that her mother's greatest fear had not been scandal but loss of control, and that fear had driven Margaret to choose destruction over vulnerability, authority over empathy. Eleanor also understood that society had rewarded that choice, reinforcing the cycle that punished deviation while preserving power. When Eleanor was finally allowed limited correspondence under supervision, she chose not to write to her family, knowing that any communication would serve their narrative rather than hers, and instead focused inward, cultivating a sense of self that existed independent of validation or forgiveness. In quiet moments, she imagined an alternate life, not defined by transgression or punishment. Not as escapism, but as reminder that the future had once been open, that her worth had never truly depended on compliance. Though the institution confined her body, it could not fully contain her consciousness, and in that space between control and resistance, Eleanor survived. By the time Margaret Whitfield passed away years later, Eleanor learned of it through a brief notice, devoid of sentiment, and she felt no urge to mourn, only a distant acknowledgement that the force which had dictated her fate was gone. Yet the system Margaret embodied endured, and Eleanor understood that her story was not unique but emblematic, one thread in a vast tapestry of silenced lives woven into the fabric of Southern respectability. As Eleanor continued to live in the margins, her existence unrecorded by the society that had condemned her, she carried with her the knowledge that survival itself was an act of quiet rebellion, and though she would never reclaim the life taken from her, she refused to let her mother's version of events be the final word. Time did not heal Eleanor Whitfield, but it reshaped her, sanding down the raw edges of grief and replacing them with something harder and more deliberate, a kind of inward vigilance that never slept. Inside the institution, seasons announced themselves not through freedom or celebration, but through subtle changes in routine, heavier fabrics issued in winter, longer hours of labor during summer, the same prayers repeated with mechanical devotion regardless of weather or mood. Eleanor learned to read time through her own body instead, through the deepening ache in her joints, the faint silvering at her temples, the way memories of Atlanta began to feel less like lived experience and more like a story told to her by someone else. Yet even as the past softened around the edges, one truth remained painfully sharp. Her mother's punishment had succeeded exactly as intended. Eleanor had been removed not because she was dangerous, but because she had revealed a crack in the illusion of moral superiority that families like the Whitfields depended upon, and that realization followed her everywhere, settling into her thoughts like a shadow that refused to lift. Within the walls of the institution, Eleanor slowly became invisible, no longer the subject of scrutiny or gossip, just another woman whose youth had been repurposed into penance. The matrons noted her obedience with approval, mistaking her quiet autonomy for submission, unaware that Eleanor had learned long ago how to perform compliance while guarding her inner life fiercely. She observed everything, how authority was enforced through routine rather than violence, how shame functioned as currency, how women were taught to police one another in the absence of male oversight. These observations sharpened her understanding of the world she had been cast out from, and with each passing year, Eleanor realized that her mother's cruelty had not been an anomaly, but a distilled expression of a broader system that demanded female sacrifice to maintain male power and social stability. Occasionally, new arrivals brought echoes of Atlanta society with them, whispered updates about who had married whom, which families had risen or fallen, and Eleanor listened not with longing, but with a detached curiosity, as though studying the movements of a machine she had once been trapped inside. She learned that the Whitfield estate continued to thrive, that Margaret's reputation had only grown more formidable in the years following Eleanor's exile, cited approvingly as an example of righteous discipline. This knowledge did not surprise Eleanor. It confirmed what she already knew, that society rewarded control, not compassion, and that the suffering of one young woman was a small price to pay for the reassurance of order. Yet even as Eleanor withdrew from the world that had condemned her, the world did not fully release its grip. One afternoon, many years after her arrival, Eleanor was summoned unexpectedly to the matron's office, where she was informed that a visitor had requested to see her. The request itself was unusual enough to unsettle her, but when she learned the visitor's name, a slow, cold clarity spread through her chest. Thomas Caldwell's younger sister had come, not out of loyalty or affection, but curiosity, drawn by rumors she had half heard growing up, stories that never quite added up. The meeting was brief, constrained by supervision, yet charged with unspoken tension. The young woman studied Eleanor with an intensity that bordered on fascination, searching her face for signs of corruption or madness, and Eleanor realized she was being examined not as a person but as a relic, proof that scandal could be contained and survived. When the visitor asked carefully worded questions about repentance and faith, Eleanor responded politely, offering nothing that could be used to reinforce the narrative imposed upon her. Afterward, she felt neither anger nor validation, only a renewed awareness of how her existence continued to serve others' needs without her consent. That encounter marked a subtle shift within her, strengthening her resolve to exist beyond the roles assigned to her, even if that existence remained unseen. Eleanor began to invest herself more deeply in the quiet intellectual resistance she had cultivated over years, expanding her secret writing, not only recording her own memories, but analyzing the structure of power that had shaped her fate. She wrote about her mother not as a monster but as a product of fear, about Atlanta society not as uniquely cruel but as honest in its priorities, about herself not as a fallen daughter but as an unwilling witness to truths that polite society refused to confront. Writing became a form of survival that transcended personal catharsis. It became an assertion that her story mattered, even if no one ever read it. She imagined future generations stumbling upon such accounts, questioning the narratives handed down to them, and in that imagining she found a fragile sense of purpose. As years accumulated, Eleanor's health began to falter, and the institution, ever pragmatic, adjusted her duties accordingly, assigning her to less physically demanding tasks, unaware that the slowing of her body only intensified the activity of her mind. She noticed how easily women were forgotten once they ceased to be useful symbols, how invisibility could be both punishment and protection. In this space between relevance and neglect, Eleanor felt a strange freedom, no longer bound by expectation, no longer required to perform virtue for an audience. She thought often of her mother in these later years, not with hatred but with a distant, almost clinical curiosity, wondering whether Margaret had ever doubted her choices, whether she had recognized the cost of her righteousness. Eleanor suspected the answer was no. Doubt would have undermined the very foundation of Margaret's identity, and such foundations were rarely examined by those who benefited from them. When news of Margaret's death reached Eleanor, it was delivered without ceremony, as though announcing a change in weather, and Eleanor received it with the same quiet composure she had learned to perfect. There was no release in that knowledge, no sudden restoration of agency, only a confirmation that the chapter of direct control had ended, while the system it represented continued uninterrupted. In the aftermath, Eleanor was offered the possibility of relocation, a modest freedom that came with conditions, yet she hesitated, understanding that the world beyond the institution had not evolved into a place that welcomed women like her. Ultimately, she chose to remain where she was, not out of fear, but because she had carved out a form of existence on her own terms, however lee. In the twilight of her life, Eleanor reflected not on what had been taken from her, but on what she had managed to preserve, her sense of self, her capacity for thought, her refusal to accept the story told about her as complete or true. She understood that her mother's punishment had been designed to erase her, to reduce her to a cautionary tale, yet here she was, still thinking, still observing, still asserting her humanity in ways that could not be catalogued or controlled. And in that persistence, Eleanor found a quiet, enduring victory, one that did not depend on forgiveness or redemption, but on the simple, radical act of continuing to exist on her own terms. As Eleanor moved deeper into the later years of her life, the institution that had once felt like a cage gradually transformed into something more ambiguous, a place that no longer actively punished her, but also offered no true release, existing in that liminal space where forgotten women were stored until history no longer had use for them. The matrons changed over time, younger women replacing older ones, bringing with them new methods but the same underlying philosophy, and Eleanor watched these transitions with the detached awareness of someone who had outlived her own scandal. To them, she was simply a fixture, a quiet presence who followed routines without resistance, whose past was rumored but rarely discussed. This anonymity granted her a strange kind of safety, allowing her thoughts to roam freely even as her body remained confined. She spent long hours in the small garden allotted to the residents, tending to plants that bloomed and withered predictably, finding in their cycles a reflection of lives shaped by forces beyond individual control. In these moments of solitude, Eleanor reflected on the broader implications of her story, understanding that what had happened to her was not an aberration, but a warning mechanism, designed to keep other women compliant through fear rather than understanding. She had become a symbol without consent, her punishment serving as silent reinforcement of the boundaries placed around female desire, curiosity, and autonomy. Over time, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts in the world beyond the institution's walls, brought in through fragments of conversation and rare printed notices, whispers of growing abolitionist sentiment, debates about women's education, the faint tremors of social change that suggested the rigid order she had known was not as immutable as it once seemed. These changes did not promise redemption for Eleanor, but they offered context, situating her suffering within a larger historical movement that questioned the very structures her mother had defended so fiercely. She realized that her life, though constrained, intersected with forces that would eventually reshape the world that had condemned her, and this realization brought a quiet, bittersweet satisfaction. Eleanor began sharing pieces of her perspective cautiously with a few younger women who arrived at the institution burdened by their own scandals, offering not comfort but clarity, encouraging them to see beyond the shame imposed upon them and recognize the systems at work. She never spoke explicitly of her own experiences unless asked directly, preferring to guide through observation rather than confession, and these exchanges became a subtle form of mentorship that gave her days a renewed sense of purpose. The younger women listened with a mix of fear and gratitude, sensing that Eleanor's calm was not resignation but resilience, a lesson rarely taught in a world that prized obedience over understanding. As her health continued to decline, Eleanor felt an increasing urgency to preserve her thoughts, expanding her secret writings into a more deliberate record, carefully hiding pages within the institution's forgotten corners. She wrote not with bitterness but with precision, documenting the emotional economy of punishment, the way reputations were protected through sacrifice, the unspoken agreements that allowed cruelty to masquerade as virtue. These writings were not intended to absolve her or condemn her mother alone. They were meant to expose the logic that made such actions possible, to offer future readers a lens through which to interpret similar patterns in their own time. Eleanor understood that history often sanitized suffering, transforming lived pain into abstract lessons, and she resisted this by anchoring her narrative in lived detail, insisting on complexity where society preferred simplicity. In her quieter moments, Eleanor contemplated forgiveness, not as reconciliation, but as release from the weight of constant analysis, and she realized that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be directed not toward her mother, but toward herself for having internalized blame that was never hers to bear. This internal shift marked a profound transformation, allowing Eleanor to view her younger self with compassion rather than regret, recognizing the courage it had taken simply to desire something beyond prescribed boundaries. The institution, unaware of the internal evolution taking place within its walls, continued its routines unchanged, reinforcing the illusion that control equated to order, that silence equated to peace. Yet Eleanor knew that beneath that surface, countless untold stories simmered, each woman carrying her own version of suppressed truth. As Eleanor's strength waned, she found herself thinking less about Atlanta and more about the abstract idea of legacy, questioning what it meant to leave something behind when one's life had been deliberately erased from public record. She concluded that legacy was not confined to recognition or remembrance, but lived in the quiet transmission of insight, in the subtle ways one person's clarity could influence another's understanding. Even if her writings were never discovered, the act of composing them had already reshaped her relationship to her past, transforming trauma into testimony. Eleanor's final years were marked by an unusual calm, not because her circumstances improved, but because she had ceased measuring her worth against the standards that had once destroyed her. She no longer sought validation from a society that had proven incapable of offering it, instead grounding her sense of self in the knowledge that she had endured without surrendering her inner life. In this way, Eleanor Whitfield became something her mother had never intended, not a warning, not a lesson, but a quiet challenge to the logic of control, a living reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems of repression could not fully extinguish human agency. As she approached the end of her life, Eleanor did so without spectacle or recognition, her passing likely to be recorded in a ledger with the same brevity that had marked her arrival. Yet within that unremarkable conclusion lay a profound truth, that survival, stripped of acknowledgement, remained a form of resistance, and that the story of a woman silenced could still echo through time in ways power could neither predict nor prevent. Eleanor Whitfield's death passed through the institution quietly, as she herself had learned to do, marked only by a brief notation in a ledger that recorded her name, age, and the vague cause of decline. And then the routines resumed as if nothing of consequence had occurred, because in places designed to contain women rather than remember them, endings are treated as administrative details rather than human events. Her few belongings were sorted efficiently, her plain dresses reassigned, her bed prepared for another arrival, and the garden she had tended so carefully was left untended for a season before another set of hands took over. No funeral announcement was sent to Atlanta, no family summoned, no public reckoning demanded, and in that silence, Margaret Whitfield's final victory seemed complete. Yet what the institution could not catalogue or destroy were the pages Eleanor had hidden over the years, folded carefully into walls, tucked beneath floorboards, concealed inside hollowed bindings in the small library, fragments of a life that refused to be reduced to a moral anecdote. Months later, during renovations prompted by structural decay, a worker uncovered the first of these writings, and though he could not fully grasp their significance, he recognized that they were not ordinary devotional notes or confessions of guilt. They were sharp, lucid, and unsettling, written in a hand that betrayed education and discipline, but also something rarer, clarity born of suffering. The pages circulated quietly among staff before reaching a local clergyman who recognized in them a dangerous kind of truth, not scandalous in detail, but subversive in implication, because they did not ask for forgiveness or offer repentance, but instead dissected the very mechanisms by which virtue had been weaponized. Alarmed, he attempted to suppress them, yet as often happens with suppressed truths, copies had already been made, shared discreetly, read by those who recognized in Eleanor's words reflections of their own unspoken doubts. Over time, fragments of her writing surfaced in unexpected places, quoted anonymously in pamphlets discussing women's education, referenced obliquely in sermons cautioning against excessive moral rigidity, and though Eleanor's name was rarely attached, her perspective began to seep into the cultural consciousness like a slow, persistent leak. Atlanta itself would change in the decades following Eleanor's exile, battered by war, reshaped by loss, forced to confront contradictions it had long ignored, and while Margaret Whitfield's reputation endured in family histories as an emblem of strength, it lost some of its luster as new generations questioned the cost of such strength. The Whitfield estate eventually passed into other hands, its history recast as heritage rather than lived experience, yet whispers of the daughter who vanished lingered at the edges of polite storytelling, often dismissed, occasionally reconsidered. Eleanor's life, stripped of public acknowledgement, nevertheless achieved a kind of afterlife through influence rather than recognition, her thoughts traveling further than her body ever could. What made Eleanor's story endure was not the shock of her scandal, but the quiet precision with which it exposed a broader truth, that societies built on rigid control inevitably sacrifice individuals to preserve illusion, and that the most brutal punishments are often delivered not with rage, but with calm certainty. Eleanor had understood this long before her death, and in understanding it, she had reclaimed agency in a world determined to deny it. She was not redeemed in the way society prefers, through forgiveness or restoration, but through persistence, through the refusal to internalize a narrative that cast her as corrupt rather than constrained. In the end, Eleanor Whitfield did not need absolution because she had committed no crime against morality, only against expectation, and expectation, she learned, is often the cruelest judge of all. Her story challenges us not because it is unique, but because it is familiar, echoing patterns that repeat whenever reputation is valued over humanity, whenever control is mistaken for virtue, whenever silence is enforced in the name of order. And that is why this story still matters, why it unsettles rather than comforts, because it asks a question that has no easy answer: how many lives have been quietly destroyed to protect appearances, and how often has cruelty been praised as discipline simply because it wore the mask of righteousness? If this story held you, disturbed you, or made you see the past, and perhaps the present, a little differently, then now is the moment to become part of this channel's journey into the histories that were never meant to be told this way. Subscribe to Born into Darkness. Hi. The bell icon so you don't miss the next buried truth, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you, because these stories survive only when they are heard, remembered, and questioned, and Eleanor Whitfield's voice, once silenced, deserves to echo as far as it possibly can.